Have you ever tried having it just like that? Or
It's gonna catch you.
it's not going to work?
You'll figure it out. Good morning, everyone. We'd like to start. Grab your bagels, grab your coffee, grab your cookies. So
Did you get an email from me or no?
I don't know yet.
Okay.
I
I'll
don't.
resend
I
it.
haven't seen it. Good morning. It's good to see everyone who have arrived. This is we're very happy every time to see the multitudes flock to Hold of the Bagel and our other adult ed programs. It's becoming a very nice Sunday morning tradition. If anyone here doesn't know me, I'm Rabbi Or Zohar. When we started this journey of Hold of the Bagel, when we planned it in the summer, the whole semester, we looked at the calendar and said, oh my, there's going to be elections at the middle of this. And then it crossed our minds that it might be somewhat of an intense period for many of us. Regardless of who we may support politically, on Tuesday, half the country is going to be happy, the other half is going to be disappointed, and all that can bring all sorts of, thoughts, concerns, emotions, etc. So we said, well, what can we do in order to help contain and, hold this energy around the election day? And we said, well, maybe what we need is some historical perspective, right? Because in the Jewish tradition, we know that one of the things that makes us strong is we look at events that are happening now, and we think, oh, it's the most, and then you get some historical perspective of thousands of years, and you can say, oh, but we've been oppressed before, there's been ups and downs, blah, blah, so like that, and we get some wisdom from that perspective. Then we thought, well, so we need some American perspective. And then we said, oh, there's an amazing thing in our community. We have many people who are very knowledgeable. One of them is a historian who teaches American history. And that is Dr. James Spieler, our former president. We requested that, the royal requested that Dr. Spieler would give us some historic perspectives about what we're experiencing now, and hopefully that will allow us to maybe get a nuance or an understanding or a conversation that will be constructive to what's happening this week. Before I hand you the imaginary mic, I will just say that two things. One, three announcements. One, today at 11, the Social Action Committee of Temple Sinai is holding a program. They're actually creating kits for, Leslie, you want to say a word about that? Yeah. You'll say it better than me. You'll say it better than me.
So we're making care bags for people who are having abortion. So the idea is after their abortion, we're working with Planned Parenthood, we're partnering. This is actually the fourth time we're doing it. We have been looking at what can we do in this situation, how can we support people coming to New York and already here in New York who are having abortions, knowing that people cannot get them in every state, so people are coming to New York. We also realized the first time it's a very quick process to make about 180 bags. So we have a small, not to repeat an education, we know you're here for a class right now, but we have a 15-minute educational piece about this. Before we start, we have a guest coming from Planned Parenthood to talk about what they're seeing, if they are seeing people from outside of New York, and how our care kits are being received. So again, we do this every fall and every spring, so we invite you to join us today after Hole of the Bagel, after your discussion. And we sort of think of this sometimes as a women's issue. We're not getting pregnant alone, usually. So we'd like to encourage everyone to join us. We'll be finished by 11:30 as well. So just again, want to encourage everyone, welcome everyone, invite everyone to join us today. So
Thank you, Leslie. Last comment. Last week we started our Jewish spirituality class on Wednesdays. It's called Rosh Hashanah. You can still join. So it's going to be this Wednesday at 7 p.m. There are 7 sessions in this series for now. We're very excited to see that there was a great interest and large attendance. And even if you missed the first one, you can still join. So that's Rochester Jewish Spirituality right in this room, Wednesdays at 7. And now without no further ado, or, let's, yeah, thank you, and thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to be with everybody. Over the past few years, have had, the great privilege, the great honor, and the sometimes exhausting task of working with so many of you and as a leader of Temple Sinai. And I said any number of times when I was able to speechify or write in the bulletin that these are dramatic times. And we're here to talk about some drama and in our kind of political and election right now. We've experienced a pandemic, we've experienced wrenching events in the Middle East and incidents of anti-Semitism and so on. And I've said over the course of the past few years how grounding it is to be part of this congregation at times like this, a congregation that is inquisitive, has shared values of tikkun olam and engaging in the world. And indeed, it's been very therapeutic and very helpful to be part of this congregation at this time. And this moment of talking about the election kind of aligns with that well. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to present some information and historical context that many of you may be very familiar with, because the period I'm going to be talking about is a period that many of us lived, and many of us have lived a little bit longer. The period I'll be talking about is largely since World War II, largely since the 1960s, and some people have more direct memories of the political history than I do. So after presenting some information, and I'm happy to take questions while I'm talking, although if we could hold most of those till the end, I'll also suggest any number of things that we can discuss and talk about pertaining to this election, pertaining to what are the historical precedents for it, as well as what are some of the things that I think, and maybe you think, are radical departures from modern American political history. So what I just want to start by saying is that I imagine many of us, let's see, okay, it was working before. I imagine many of us are experiencing, like me, high anxiety, blood pressure spikes on a daily basis over an apparently tied election. An election that in many ways seems to be a radical break with American political culture and history, and while indeed there are some departures as I see it, I think there are also many continuities and harmonies with the past century of political history that I would like to kind of talk through a little bit. But just throwing together some images that kind of bring home the stakes and how close the election is, the polls. This is just a snapshot of what one mainstream poll has showed over the past couple weeks. What this graph on the upper right shows is that the errors in the median average polling in recent elections, right? So what the end bar graphs over on the upper right show was that in the past two election cycles, polls overestimated the Democratic presidential candidates, like polling voting preference, and in a context of polls that seem to show such a close match between the candidates for all parties, and I both mean the Democrat and Republican Party, but all of us, that close poll, it can't help but lead to anxiety and uncertainty as to what the outcome will be. We've seen in the past few elections an increasing focus on swing states as key to the election, as a partisan divide has grown in the country and hardened geographically. So certain states are very predictably blue, Democrat. very predictably red Republican that may have been more in contention in previous years. And so you can imagine, I mean, however high my blood pressure has been, and maybe yours in the past few weeks, imagine what it would have been like living in Pennsylvania or living in Wisconsin, Nevada, or Arizona, that as the lower right here shows the amount of political spending that has been going in advertisements there. I can't even imagine what it's like to turn on a television or to have your phone constantly, I mean, 24/7, feeding the political ads that folks are getting. I know it makes my blood pressure go. And I'm grateful, frankly, to be in a state that doesn't have that kind of political ad focus. So in terms of this election, things that we'll talk a bit about trying to put into some perspective and or that we can talk about afterwards is one, are we witnessing since 2016 and continuing now what, for instance, Fareed Zakaria and many other political scientists are saying are signs of a political realignment. A realignment in which the Republican Party in particular is in dramatic transformation, a political realignment in terms of the demographics of the country and who tends to vote by gender, by race, by geography, by age, by class for which party. Are we in a realignment, or are we certainly seeing the disruption that comes from a weakening of the party system, particularly a weakening of the party system vis-a-vis the Republican Party? We're in an election in which major issues divide the two candidates. Now, there are many people who say, oh, the two candidates, the parties are both establishment parties and are both reflections of, the same, critics say any number of things, kind of corporate interest, political system, what have you. I would argue that they're dramatically different with dramatically different political and policy platforms. We have, in terms of foreign policy, a contest between a vision of the United States as an engaged leader of an international order, which has been a traditional consensus position since World War II. That consensus position has been disrupted since 2016, where Donald Trump and his political movement have promoted a nationalist vision of American foreign policy, which we can talk a little bit about later. Economically, there are dramatic differences between these two parties, or the two candidates representing those parties. We have, in one, I write political economy. What I mean by that is one party has a vision of what I'll go in more detail, a liberal economic policy that imagines the federal government as a critical agent in ensuring economic predictability, stability, and vitality, whereas another has a vision of reducing federal government involvement in the economy in significant ways. Two different visions of American international trade policy, one based on protectionism and what's often called industrial policy, another in the form of the Democratic Party continuing to promote what has been a largely consensus position of expanding global trade. Very different positions. In terms of immigration, we have very different positions. Immigration has, over the course of the last century, been relatively consensus position across the two political parties, with moments of erupting partisan difference. We're in a period of maximal disruption of that political consensus around immigration. We have one party in particular that has become a hardened anti-immigration party, which many of us may have reflected on the expression of the replacement theory motivating one side. For folks who don't know, it's an ideology that immigrants are being enabled to come into the United States by elite globalists, elite internationalists, read the Democratic Party, and are doing so specifically to replace the kind of traditional racial composition of the United States and replace and frankly, to vote Democrat and achieve political hegemony that way. We have parties that are very different on social issues, abortion, sexuality, which in this election is expressing itself. I saw Sharon's button. Where's Sharon? Sharon, your button is about Prop 1, which is essentially ERA, and you'll see a lot of anti-Prop 1 signs saying no men playing on women's sports teams, right? Many folks are focusing on this issue of trans in that regard. Very significant differences in terms of opinions about health and health insurance, democracy and elections, the issue of whether folks will accept and have trust in the machinery of American democracy, and calls to secure and or suppress the vote are very prominent in this particular election, making it, there are historical precedents for this, but I would argue that the intensity of distrust in the machinery of government and having a candidate who is openly prepared to question the vote is historically unprecedented in modern US history. The issue of misinformation and disinformation, which has long historical precedents, has only become more intense as the media landscape has fractured with social media, with thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different platforms of information competing for attention, a breakdown of the traditional broadcast news landscape of media means that misinformation, disinformation, and fueling of mistrust is evident in this election in a way that it hasn't in previous elections. Okay, keep moving on. So first thing I would just say is recognizing my anxiety, maybe recognizing others' anxiety, and before we dive in, I just want to, inspired by the High Holy Day service where we read an excerpt of a prayer for the United States, thought I would share this brief excerpt and read it, hopefully grounding us, recognizing the importance of this election, the importance of voting, and the importance of speaking with one another, perhaps across political differences in a way that is supportive and respectful of one another. So God of holiness and freedom, inspire us through your teachings and commandments to love and uphold our precious democracy. Let every citizen take responsibility for the rights and freedoms we cherish. Let each of us be an advocate for justice, an advocate for liberty, a defender of dignity, and let us champion the values that make our nation a haven for the persecuted, a beacon of hope among the nations. Okay, I'll try to move through this as quickly as I can. So what I want to do is frame the current political environment to provide some kind of historical context by talking about what a number of political scientists and historians call political eras or political frameworks. And to talk about the period from the 1930s to the 1970s is what many historians call the liberal era, an era of democratic liberalism. The period of roughly the 1970s to maybe 2016 question mark, which many folks call the neoliberal era, the democratic neoliberal era. We'll talk about what that means. And since 2016, thank you. 2016 question mark. Are we in a period, what Fareed Zakaria and others call a new era of political realignment, an era of disruption that may result in a new era of a political framework? Okay. So in terms of the liberal era, the root word of liberal is liberty. Liberty is individual freedom and equality under the law, right? One of the innovations in the American experiment in the 19th century was rising as a political principle, the notion of liberty and liberalism, that people should enjoy equality under the law, and that the government exists by, for, and of the people. Now, of course, in the 19th century, arguably today, the dignity and equality of all people under the law is certainly in question. But part of the American experiment was to grow liberty, has been growing liberty for people across race, gender, and other categories. In the 19th century, liberalism meant freedom and protection of individuals from largely government power, right? 19th century classical liberalism. In the 20th century, particularly in the crisis of the Great Depression, the word liberal changed. Whereas to be a liberal in the 1920s, President Herbert Hoover called himself a liberal, was to have minimal government intervention in a market-driven economy and a society in which individuals and their communities decided their own freedom. In the 1930s, those folks who had called themselves liberal became conservative. And the word liberal became attached to a very different vision, a vision that historians call defining of this era that led to the 1970s, a vision of individual freedom and individual opportunity secured not by protecting individuals from federal government power, but by federal government being an agent in individuals realizing their equality under the law and individuals realizing their opportunity in the economy and education, etc. This emergent consensus, this liberal consensus that you can see really comes to fruition during the administrations of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sometimes this is called New Deal liberalism, named after the New Deal programs of the 1930s. Part of this emergent consensus was, in terms of the domestic economy, that the federal government had a role in regulating the financial industry, right? Not only regulating the financial industry, but by providing a backdrop to protect individual citizens. For those of you who've ever had a bank account in an FDIC-insured bank, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, this is just one small sign of this vision, this liberal vision of federal government intervention in economic affairs. Also, federal government has a responsibility to be a fiscal responsibility in terms of stimulating aggregate demand in an economy to create a vibrant economy. So what did the federal government start to do in the 1930s, continues to do to this day? And that is a major flashpoint in our political campaign of 2024, and arguably will continue. One, federal government has a role in securing the agricultural sector through agricultural subsidies, which continue to this day to billions of dollars a year. Federal government has a role in infrastructure development, right? As we see in the TVA. The federal government has a role in stimulating mass purchasing power so that the American market has sufficient demand to consume the brilliantly productive things that the American market produces, right? And the support for labor unions in the 1930s was predicated in part on this idea that if you want millions of people to have income and wealth to purchase cars, to purchase furniture, then giving labor the protections to collectively bargain can raise the rates of wage rates of labor so that there's greater mass purchasing power to create a vibrant economy, right? So the federal government supporting labor to enhance mass purchasing power, to enhance aggregate demand. The federal government creating insurance programs, not welfare, insurance in the form of Social Security and later Medicare, with the idea that this is going to put purchasing power in retired people's hands who previously were the most impoverished people in the United States in the 1930s, so on. Federal subsidies for home ownership, probably one of the most important things that has come out of the 1930s and that underlines, that undergirds the so-called liberal consensus of federal involvement in the economy. The landscape we live in, suburban landscape, was made possible through federal subsidies and incentives. And we can see in the graph on the lower right, this spike right here is during World War II, when federal government spending spikes. But ever since then, we can see this liberal consensus of federal government having a role in the economy represented in a nearly 20% on average federal spending as a percentage of the size of the American economy. It has remained almost unchanged, right? So we see that as part of this liberal consensus. This liberal consensus that begins in the 1930s, but really firms up during World War II and then the Cold War, is an emerging consensus of what is often called liberal internationalism. The United States being the leader of a world that engages with one another and respects the sovereignty of independent countries. You can see during World War II, the discourse of United Nations fighting for freedom in the aftermath of World War II becomes the branding of a United Nations and a vision of an international world order that the United States kind of invited and sponsored. 1945, the UN and the United States also helped to build the other institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other sort of institutions that create a new world order, a liberal international order in which the United States was a leading force in bringing a community together to negotiate rather than to fight and conquer one another. This was a world order that very quickly became divided between a capitalist democratic world and a communist world. You can see the political editorial poster on the right. But the consensus until the 1970s was that the United States needed to take this active role in the world for its own national security, for its own economic security, and to build a world order that would not descend into the mayhem of another world war. This consensus was never absolute. Even during World War II, or the initial phases of it, we had an America First movement, right? There's never seemed, the brand, the America First, the Make America Great Again, these things don't just emerge out of nowhere. There tends to be a long history of it. And folks may know of Charles Lindbergh and others who during the before the United States entered World War II, advocated for neutrality, saying that to enter World War II, to be engaged in international affairs, would undercut liberty at home, would militarize American society, would warp the economy towards military production, would undermine American freedom, etc. And if folks haven't seen the political editorial cartoons that Dr. Seuss drew during World War II, you can see this Dr. Seuss editorial cartoon in which he's kind of stitching together the beards of the America First with essentially Nazism as kind of being one and the same. And I'm sure that any number of you were thinking about the 1939, thank you, right there on my slide. As a historian, one of the things I need to confess is I'm really bad holding on to dates. Big picture stuff's okay. So yeah, Madison Square rally in which I think it was 10,000 American Nazis rallied under the banner of Americanism. And I think that for many people, the symbolism and the connections were very evident a week ago when there was another rally held at Madison Square Garden, right? So emerging consensus about domestic economic policy, emerging consensus about foreign policy. But there were fractures in this liberal consensus that emerged almost immediately, and they emerged first and foremost around the issue of race. Now, this period of this liberal consensus created an incredible opportunity in the United States for gains of civil rights for African Americans, and in the wake of that civil rights movement, for women, for gay, lesbian, LGBTQ, etc., right? We see in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, 1968 Housing Act. Incredible gains in terms of civil rights during this period, and I could talk about why, but I want to move forward. We also see, related to that, changes in American immigration policy that reflect this kind of openness and engagement with the world. Whereas the 1924 Immigration Act dramatically limited immigration to the United States and created a quota system that blocked out any immigration from parts of the world where people were not eligible to become naturalized American citizens. Does anybody know what 1790 law, reaffirmed in 1890, determined who could become an American citizen once you immigrated to the country to naturalize? David? No, the naturalization category as to who could become an American citizen upon immigrating to, you can immigrate and just be a documented worker, but to actually apply and to become an American citizen, you had to be white. The law said you had to be white, right? And the 1924 law banned basically immigration from any part of the world in which somebody could not become an American citizen, very much sculpting the demographics in the United States until two laws, first in 1952, which changed the naturalization category to no longer say that you could be white. Excuse me. You okay? Yeah. Why? Well, in part because it was an embarrassment for the United States, which was engaging against Communist Soviet Union to develop allies around the world. And the Soviet Union was very effectively using propaganda of American racism against the United States. So we see these kind of civil rights gains. Who can get citizenship? For citizens, African Americans under the 14th Amendment, will they get more equal rights under the law? Yes, and we see too in 1965 a change in the immigration law from 1924 that includes people from Asia and Africa, among other places, as being quota within the quota system, enabling them to immigrate. In other words, a liberalization of the immigration system. These efforts created political blowback and were the first fracture that opens up in this period of the liberal consensus. And we see a sign of this in the 1948 election, in which Democrat Harry Truman, who had taken the presidency as vice president when FDR dies, and he's running for president in 1948 against primarily Republican governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. And just as an aside, many folks may know this famous picture here. The polls were profoundly inaccurate and predicted a strong Dewey win. In fact, Truman wins, and that's the famous picture there. But what I kind of want to focus on is on the bottom here, behind this bar here, you see that there was a third-party candidate who ran, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, ran on the Dixiecrat third party, whose motto, whose trademark image was the Confederate flag, and was running. Why? Because Truman had proposed desegregating the military and had a blue ribbon civil rights commission. What had been the heart of the American Democratic Party for a century, the Deep South, we see a glimmer of what's about to happen in the coming decades to fracture the Democratic Party's, the demographic of it, which undermines the this liberal era. We see the Dixiecrats take the third party, the Deep South, okay? We see in the next few elections in 1952, 56, and 60, a reversion back, the blue being Democrat, of the Deep South reverting back to its Democratic core. But in 1964, as a Republican Party runs, who at the time was considered, certainly by this broad liberal consensus, as a radical, an extreme conservative, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, who embraced that and said, extremism on behalf of freedom is a virtue, right? And the Republican Party under Barry Goldwater, emphasized states' rights, particularly vis-a-vis the question of racial civil rights. And we can see here the shift, the beginning of a political realignment of the Democratic Party, which had as its core, since the early 19th century, the South. We saw a threat to it in 48, and in 1964 you see, with civil rights acts being delivered by Democratic president and Democratic Congress, a shift to the Republican Party. Add to that a shift in the civil rights movement at this time towards a more strident, what's often called ethno-racial pride or nationalism, Black Power, Black Panthers, as well as urban uprisings or riots, depending on how what your political framework is, throughout the United States, really shook the liberal consensus of the period of time. And we see a shift in 1968, a third party candidate, George Wallace, governor of Alabama, and Nixon, both running on campaigns of law and order. And we see that campaign reproduced itself in 2016, 2020, and 2024 as well. At the time was overt codes for issues of race and reaction to civil rights gains and demands to maintain segregation in the South. And you can see in Nixon's blowout victory of 1972, basically all of the South, as well as the rest of the country, goes to Richard Nixon. It was a major, major blowout.
And his Southern strategy.
And the Southern strategy of largely law and order and of coded language about civil rights and segregation. And yeah, so it was a particular effort to get the South. Many people saw in that election a political realignment, and they started to call for the death of the Democratic hegemony, control of government, and a breakdown of what the liberal era. But with Watergate, we see a disruption to that, and we see actually in the next election, the South vote for the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a Protestant fundamentalist evangelical Christian and still is, 100 years going. And I don't know if folks know this, but barely 2 months before being the Democratic candidate for president in 1976, Jimmy Carter was knocking door to door, spreading the gospel of Jesus, right? So I think in part the unusual character of him as a Democratic candidate saw the South hold a little bit more. But you can see in this graph on the lower left, with Watergate, and then the next fracture to the liberal consensus, the Vietnam War, trust in government and trust in institutions starts to plummet. And then fueled by a change of our media landscape, it's at this period of time where cable television is displacing the broadcast model. It is at this time where direct mail, computer-based voter targeting is able to start sending messages that are not standard, least objectionable messages, but are targeted, sensational, grievance-based, type of messages, all work to create a feedback loop, fueling distrust of government, fueling distrust of institutions. Compounded by the Vietnam War, which just we'll simply say compounded by the Vietnam War. If you want to talk about it more, we can do that. Trust in government, and also the consensus around American role in the world shatters after the Vietnam War, right? Breaking into groups that, conventional democratic groups that would say the United States should be involved, but as a force of facilitating diplomacy. You get conservatives who call themselves conservatives, who said we need to have a powerful military and exert military power rarely and only when it is in America's strict national interest and when the United States can win overwhelming victories. And a third group that you've probably heard of, the so-called neoconservatives, who reacted to the aftermath of Vietnam by saying that the United States needs to redouble its effort around the world, including military effort, to spread democracy and support allies who are democratic. So you get this breaking up of a foreign policy consensus. What also fractures this period of time is the economic crisis of the 1970s, which many people here remember, and perhaps you can share some thoughts about in a bit. It was during the 1970s, and you see on the left here, the blue line is economic growth. There was periods of severe recession in the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, coincident with spiking unemployment, and what was unusual in modern American history was spiking inflation at the same time. Economists said that inflation and unemployment would never spike together. They did, coming in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the debacle of that, coming in the aftermath of incredible intensifying racial politics. It created a poisonous political environment in which the very precepts of the liberal consensus came into question. And I guess just the other two images to show here, folks may remember OPEC oil embargo, and what the United States woke up to was energy politics and the volatility of the cost of energy. And in the lower right, it was at this period of time where the United States, after decades of supporting its allies in Europe and Japan to rebuild themselves, they had rebuilt their industries beautifully and were starting to outcompete the United States in trade. And the United States went from a net trade exporter to a net trade importer. Trade deficits began at this time and really began to undermine this liberal consensus about this international trading order, which many people say these fractures opened up a new political framework, a new political era that many call the neoliberal era. Neo means new. The new classical liberal era. In other words, a throwback to 19th century liberalism that saw a strong and free and vital country facilitated not through federal government intervention, that's the 20th century liberal consensus, but instead by getting government out of the way and letting market forces drive freedom and prosperity, right? So a return to 19th century vision of what a liberal, free, and prosperous world would be. And if the liberal era had as its reigning icon FDR, and I show you a picture of two Oval Offices, Biden's Oval Office and Trump's Oval Office, and you'll notice whose portraits are on the wall, right? The neoliberal era's icon is certainly Ronald Reagan, right? And this new neoliberal era, as historians call it, had a different electoral coalition, which I'll talk about in a second, and entailed different domestic policy pertaining to the economy, social conservatism, and foreign policy as well. I'm just trying to see what my next slide is. We can see here, first of all, in these maps, this is Reagan's win in 1980, 1984, and then his Vice President George H.W. Bush's win in 1988. Notice, first of all, how blowout these elections were and the solid red of the South. The full political realignment of the Republican Party to the southern states to the Republican Party is evident in here. Let's see. So the electoral coalition, South, Christian fundamentalists who had not been politically activated until this time. Does anybody know what was the first trigger that activated Protestant evangelical fundamentalists to become active in politics and tied to the Republican Party? What's the most common explanation? Roe v. Wade, right? It wasn't interestingly Roe v. Wade. By the early 1980s, that became a galvanizing force for Christian fundamentalists. It was the
Well, wasn't the recognition by the people who wanted to promote neoliberalism that the social order was changing, so they had to find a way to.
It was the profound concerns about the social order and Republican Party, the Southern strategy, the
The desegregation of schools for them to.
it was the fact that the IRS was threatening to take away tax-exempt status of religious institutions that discriminated against and forced segregation within their institutions. That for groups that had said their spirituality and their religion would be corrupted through involvement in worldly politics, came to say they could only preserve their religious freedom by becoming active in politics. And in fact, it changed with Roe v. Wade, with feminist movement, with the ERA, among other things, came to see that they actually had a cause of, through politics, being able to spread political values that they held dear. In addition, we know domestic policy. Reagan's claim that what was the problem, or what is the scariest words that he's ever heard? That the federal government is coming to help, right? That government is not the solution, government is the problem, which was a good catchphrase for this neoliberal era of deregulation, a neoliberal era of tax cuts, a neoliberal era of weakening labor protections, whereas labor protection was seen as a way of stimulating economic activity by enhancing purchasing power of working people, right? In the neoliberal vision, labor unions were seen as cartels that would warp markets, and that property needed freedom, and that property, having freedom to pursue business as it will pursue, will create the wealth that will trickle down to everybody, right? Reduced welfare spending, question social insurance, social security, Medicare, right? We're part of this neoliberal era. Reforming immigration, not blocking it. In fact, neoliberals, like liberals, saw immigration as a way of creating a growing workforce. And for corporate employers, immigrants were a source of low-wage workforce, right? So you still see the Republican Party, even in this neoliberal age, along with the Democratic Party, being embracing of, I would call it a liberal immigration policy, right? And this neoliberal era is defined by a policy of expanded global free trade, right? In terms of foreign policy, reviving Cold War competition, massive military spending, right? It is during this period of time, which also, by the way, is when the US military is still freshly an all-volunteer army, that we see what I would call the weaponization of appreciation for people who would serve in the military as a way of intensifying the idea that patriotism equals support of a highly militarized American foreign policy, right? And what we see here, just interestingly, this neoliberal age did not mean that federal spending ended up going down. Yes, there were cuts in social welfare spending, but with the increases of military spending remained the same, but with taxes dramatically reduced. What did that mean? It meant what you see here on this graph, which shows the spending as a percentage of the gross domestic product, federal spending, the red, continues and if not grows. But what happens to government revenue? It declines, and the gap between the two represent the federal debt that was now used to finance government spending. In the liberal age, we had a much greater balance. Liberalism was progressive taxation to fund the essential services of federal government's involvement in the economy. The neoliberal age was denigrating federal role and defunding the federal government by reducing taxes at the same time that spending remained high. And we can see here on this graph on the right, an increase of the percentage of debt, or debt as a percentage of the size of the economy over this neoliberal period. So what were the strains on the neoliberal era and framework? Let's see. And I'll try to finish this up in 5 to 10 minutes at most. First of all, growing wealth inequality in the United States. This was a period of time of galloping, spectacular globalization. 1980s, particularly the end of the 1980s and 1990s. As the Cold War ended and Eastern Bloc countries, and especially China, Vietnam, and others, adopted capitalist systems, invited in American and Western capital, and became low-wage manufactories for the world, global wealth expanded dramatically, and wealth in the United States expanded dramatically. But the gap in wealth became crisis levels. So we see in this graph here, this is one measure of wealth inequality in the United States. And this isn't specifically it, but economists have a measure called the Gini coefficient, which measures the degree of wealth inequality in the United States. The highest moment of wealth inequality in the modern US history was 1929. Until today. Wealth inequality is now higher. And you can see this period of time of the liberal consensus, the 1930s through the 40s into the early 70s, high progressive taxation, federal government involvement in the economy in a way that stimulated mass home ownership, labor, collective bargaining for higher wages and income, etc. We have this period of relatively low inequality, the growth of the modern middle class, and since then we've seen wealth grow in the United States, but incredible wealth divide. And that has come at a period of time where economic predictability and security for Americans has declined dramatically as the United States has become more engaged in, profited greatly from, but in unequal ways, globalization. That created a major strain on this period of neoliberal consensus. War on terror was one of the things that masked this growing strain and committed people to a global project of spreading freedom and stability around the world. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was designed to arguably reorient the Middle East, one of the most volatile places, strategic places in the world, energy strategic place, into a more stable, into a more democratic, more capitalist, more Western-oriented realm. That invasion proved to be a strategic blunder, many people would call it, that had created ongoing crisis there and really alienated a lot of Americans who otherwise embraced neoliberal internationalism. And then finally, the global financial market meltdown of 2008, which at home spurred, among other things, the Tea Party movement, a libertarian movement that really criticized the federal government's so-called bailout of financial institutions and of American mortgage holders, and really led to, arguably, what we see come in 2016. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, like Obama before him, and like Bill Clinton before Obama, embraced a liberal framework, right? With enough of a neoliberal commitment to keep taxes low, but in a slightly restrained regulatory framework, and also embraced global free trade, right? Although Hillary Clinton had to downplay that, right? Because by the 2016 election, global free trade had become anathema in the other party. But just as an example of, again, what is the icon of the liberal era consensus, FDR. But in 2016, with the Trump essentially takeover of the Republican Party, and that's not my language, that's the language of a Republican Party establishment who watched the party change dramatically within a single election cycle as about a dozen candidates competed with one another, creating a route for Donald Trump, who had, as far as I know, never actually been a Republican before then, a registered Republican, to get the nomination. And his reorientation of the party, so-called MAGA Republicanism, One that shifted the party's position on immigration to a hardline opposition to immigration. One that was launched with, you may remember, the first thing that President Trump signed in office was a ban on Muslim immigration into the United States. His is a nationalist, as opposed to an internationalist foreign policy, often called anti-globalist. And if you listen carefully to his speeches in this election, the anti-globalism is a very specific term that emerged out of the fundamentalist Christian right, in which the fundamentalist reading of the book of Revelations talks about the danger of transnational global institutions, to use modern language. And part of the vision is that the fundamental threat to that will bring about the coming of Christ is a transnational force. So there's a lot of anti-globalism when folks talk about the black UN helicopters coming in and doing whatever it is. It's tapping into that strain of millennialist religious suspicion of internationalism, right? That combined with working class anger about international trade and offshoring of industry led to this nationalist foreign policy based on tariffs and renegotiating those trade policies, right? So in terms of economic policy, we see in Trump a mix of neoliberalism, cutting taxes, deregulating the government. There's a long historical precedent for that. But his call for nationalist breaking of trade, free trade, is a radical departure of what has been two eras defining American politics easily since World War II. That is truly unusual in this election. Conservative social policy is also in line with the neoliberal order, but I would argue it is much more intense than it ever was. When candidate Trump a couple months ago was giving a speech to Christian conservatives, and he said, "Come out to vote, and this will be the last time you ever need to do so." What do folks think he meant by that? Anybody? So a lot of folks said that this aligns with his quip that, in answer to, "Will you be a dictator?" And he said, "I'll only be a dictator on day one." Many people said this is an example of his authoritarian inclination, which also, by the way, is a radical break with modern American political history. There's been no candidate who uses the kind of rhetoric that Donald Trump uses. I mean, it's a break.
Honestly, it feels more like it's only thinking of himself. Like, he doesn't care about the Republican Party per se. Like, he only cares that he's elected, and he's only going to run one more time.
Okay. What my read on that was, he was saying, you elected me in 2016. We eliminated Roe v. Wade, as I told you we would. My Department of Education, which, by the way, I want to abolish, will unravel public education and give you tax credits for your religious schools. I'm against trans, et cetera, et cetera. You come out to vote for me, and what drew you out in the 1970s to become politically active? You were drawn out because of what you considered government overreach. I am going to give you, once and for all, the reason to retreat back, to be uncorrupted by politics, to retreat back into your religious communities, because I am going to achieve all of the things that drove you out to be politically active in the first place, right? That is my interpretation of what his signal was to them, and that is a radical departure from American political history. That kind of, not just seeming authoritarian discourse, but also the promise of that kind of lasting and complete realization of a social / Christian conservative agenda. And last is the populism. And I'll just show a few slides and we'll be finished with this. So we could talk about what populism is and stands for. In short, populists tend to be suspicious that the national political system is rigged against their interests. Populism as a term emerges in the late 19th century among farmer groups who feared that railroads, financial institutions, and agricultural corporations were all conspiring to undermine the dignity and the economic opportunity for the hardworking American farmers. And they demanded federal government intervention to support them from what they called at the time globalist bankers, Jews, corporate, interests like railroads and so on. We see in today's populism a similar kind of conspiratorial belief that elites are conspiring to undermine the dignity and the opportunity of hardworking Americans, right? And we see it too, the populist conspiracy against bankers, Jewish bankers. We see it as, concerned about liberal elites who've handed the country over and given it away to China. This is not unique to Donald Trump. We see this kind of populist kind of rhetoric threading all the way back through American history, and in more modern times, Senator Joseph McCarthy, his approach to politics, throwing out accusations without evidence, flooding the zone with all sorts of accusations of elites and so on who are undermining virtuous Americans. And you can see here in this book, the self-published book with the caption that I pulled from Amazon, as an example of what devotees of populist nationalists like McCarthy today hold. This book, St. Joseph of Wisconsin. Who is Joseph McCarthy, and why is he, without question, hands down the most widely and viciously vilified personage in American history? The official version of history, written by academic operatives, elites like me, serving the same ruling class. I think all of us here, we've got a kind of tribal connection to that ruling class, apparently, which McCarthy sought to expose, teaches us that Wisconsin's senator was a nasty bullying brute who dirtied the reputations of ... That's what they'll tell you. In fact, he was a saint who was here to save freedom and save the American people. We see this brand of populism in the John Birch Society, formed in 1958 and welcomed for the first time since it formed at the American Conservative Political Caucus meeting. The John Birch Society, who saw a conspiracy in government in which communists were bringing about civil rights. You can't see it down here, but Martin Luther King was a communist, that all these different things are communist plots foiled by an American elites. We see this populism emerge in the America First, Make America Great Again campaign of Pat Buchanan in 1992, when Pat Buchanan challenged the neoliberal candidate, George H.W. Bush, and kind of created an opening that Donald Trump would take almost 20 plus years later. And we also see it in Newt Gingrich, who introduced into the political arena the kind of warrior-like, take no negotiations, our political competitors are our enemies. That language entered the political arena, arguably, with Newt Gingrich's part of the Republican Party. Okay, so last 2 points. Trump 2024, continuing elements of neoliberalism in his proposed policies, which, by the way, one of the radical breaks in this election is in 2024, like 2020, was the first time in modern US history that one of the two political parties did not have a formal party platform. It had a 1 to 2 page ideological statement. If you look at the Democratic platform for 2024, it looks like platforms for the last 150 years. It's got chapters about economy, this, that, and the other thing. look at the Republican Party platform. It is a break with political history. I'm not editorializing that it's good or bad. It just represents how dramatic a break with conventional party politics that it has. So with Trump, you see the populism that questions elitism, that sees climate change as potentially a hoax foisted by China or scientists, elites who have it in their interest to promote an idea that gets government grants for their research. COVID and the anti-vaccine kind of position that he took, and apparently his now relationship with RFK Jr., who he recently said in a campaign he's going to allow to go wild on vaccines and on healthcare and food, and what now looks like going wild on fluoride in the water as well, if you heard RFK's speech just yesterday. So we see a disruption in politics in which you still have in a Democratic Party a commitment to the liberal era and liberal framework with the iconography of FDR. And you see in a Republican Party a profound disruption, and it's unclear if there's a realignment in place. And this editorial cartoon kind of symbolizes that, in that the iconography of Ronald Reagan, as you see in the political cartoon on the right, in which you've got Florida Governor DeSantis trying on different wigs, is part of his political persona and his political campaign, dispensing with the Reagan wig and going to the Trump wig, right? Not even to talk about January 6th, we can talk about that perhaps as a group. Last thing I'd point out is the Harris-Walz campaign, traditional liberal framework in its policies and its extensive policy proposals, and that what I'd like to do is just shift to discussion. And we could talk about any number of things, including any of these bullet points here. So thank you, and we'll start with John, is it?
I just have a quick comment. There's a wonderful book at the end of the podcast by Rachel Maddow that covers the period and the growth of what you're talking about from the 1940s on.
Yeah. What does anybody remember the name of that book?
It's prequel.
Prequel? Prequel, yeah.
This maybe is like changing the subject. Maybe we'll do it maybe later, but how important is the two-party system? It's been talked about. Just your ideas on that.
Yeah, so Les's question is about the two-party system, and I guess one thing I would suggest is that the party structure has been in a weakened state, arguably since the early 1970s. The Democratic Party in '72, followed by the Republican Party, instituted a change in the primary system. The Democratic Party wanted voters to have greater influence through primaries in electing who the nominee would be. So before '72, there were primaries, but it was at the convention that party stalwarts had essentially the votes that could determine, regardless of the primary, who the candidate was. What the primaries did was take that power, distribute it so that voters had a greater say, which weakened the party to be able to impose the kind of discipline of who would be the nominee, what would be the positions, etc., and gave a potential nominee who, with the added power of money and the added power of unlimited money come the 21st century, could work around the party as Donald Trump did in 2016 and essentially find a path to the nomination without party power. So the weakening of the party in that way arguably is one of the key things that has disrupted the recent elections. Yeah.
Yeah, I had evangelical partners in business, and they had a very different viewpoint on things. And most of them, were single issue voters, which was abortion, and it ended there. Okay, but I think there are a lot of people now who look at this election not as a political election, but an election on morality.
Yeah.
I've changed. I have stopped looking at this politically. All of this money spent on all of the advertisements no longer affects me because it's a moral issue to me. And as a matter of fact, I will be voting the entire down ballot based upon the fact that I'm afraid that somebody in the down ballot may be for somebody I don't want on the up ballot, and I don't want to take that chance. And I would like to see a complete realignment of one of the political parties. But I think the morality issue, which you didn't specifically address, is the big issue in this campaign. And I think that there are a huge number of millions of people who are single-issue voters, and that there's nothing we can do to change their mind.
And the morality issue you're talking about is the attitude towards democratic government and the Constitution. Is that what you mean?
No, I don't even
What's the
think
morality?
I don't even think it's a matter of that. I think it's a matter of what people feel is a moral way to live. Like my evangelical partners felt that anybody who was for abortion was immoral. And they couldn't accept that. And they were willing to accept anything to stop abortion and any candidate to do that. They had no, in 2016, they had no delusions about who they were voting for, but they didn't care.
So the moral issue you're describing is not Trump's character, it's policy.
Certain policies that he represents.
Yeah, so it's certainly the case that, I mean, we see here on these different graphs that the different party voters identify different priorities, and it's certainly the case in this election that abortion is a major turnout force that the Democratic Party is anticipating in women in particular and others who may feel that the Dobbs as an unprecedented pullback of constitutional rights for a substantial portion of Americans is a driving issue, and it still is the issue for many people who believe that abortion is murder and is extinguishing ensouled life before perhaps it can be baptized and given eternal salvation. They're motivated by that kind of transcends beyond the world of kind of rational politics. And one of the things about our modern age is we've got a lot of the traditional issues that drew people and created the most intense voter behavior, class issues, labor protections on the left, whatever on the right, have been disrupted by a lot of the moral issues that you're talking about. I think Liz, and then
Jamie, I'm wondering how you explain Biden's win in 2020. I mean, on the surface, it could be looked at as a signal of a change back.
yes.
So what's going on there?
Well, so Liz's question was, could a Biden's victory in 2020 and marginal majorities, by the way, in the Senate and the House signal what would be a return to that traditional liberal consensus, which he certainly represents in his very substantial accomplishments during his time in office. They fit, they stand up to certainly FDR, the energy of policy and program infrastructure, for instance, of the 1930s, or of the kind of liberal expansion of the federal state in the 1960s under LBJ. But it was also, many political scientists saw Obama's election with his stronger majorities as a sign of a swing back and realignment with the liberal consensus. And we saw that Obama's victory, which probably, which is amazing when you remember it, an African-American being elected president in the United States, considering the history of race, was a phenomenal, epoch-defining moment. Probably wouldn't have been possible without the disruptions that I mentioned of the Iraq War and of the 2008 financial crisis. And what many people saw as maybe a reasoned realignment back to a liberal order, we saw disrupted very quickly in the midterm election 2 years later and then in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. So it seems like we're in a period of instability, and it's unclear, will there be a realignment? Will there be a realignment by voting demographics? Here's the abortion issue there, in which women in particular and educated folks, which traditionally were voting blocs that went to the Republicans, are now in this election going to the Democrats. The laboring working class in the United States has forever, until the modern decades, voted Democrat, now seems to be solidly Republican. The South, which was Democrat, is now solidly Republican. And which other age demographics as well. Will more senior folks who tend to vote at higher percentages continue to vote conservative? Or will there be a change in the way that demographic age groups vote? Is a big thing that political scientists are looking for in this election as well.
So what if this is the third election in modern times in which the popular vote does not agree with the electoral college?
Yeah, so that's
Where does that put our country? And what should we do about it? Since we are, if the majority votes one way, but the electoral college goes another way, how can we realign that? With our Supreme Court the way it is, and how everything took place after 2010, basically July.
Time is up.
Oh, wise one, tell us.
Yes. This is the moment where the clouds part and the beam of light comes to me, and I see the light, and it's a great question. Obviously, our political system, we haven't had a constitutional amendment for 50 years, right? And it is unlikely that we can pass even important legislation outside of moments of acute crisis like COVID gave an opening, let alone having a constitutional amendment to change the way that the democratic electoral system plays out, especially at a moment of time in which there's been a cratering of trust and I fear a cratering of civic education, so that folks understand our democratic system, the democratic machinery, the importance of nonprofit social organizations and of participating in those organizations, to have a healthy democracy. I mean, all of those things are at play. Not to mention the fact that it's unclear what the unintended consequences of eliminating an electoral college would be. The electoral college currently gives disproportionate influence to somebody who votes in Wyoming compared to somebody who votes in New York State, right? When you have more electors per capita in Wyoming than you do in New York, there's an inequity there that gives the opportunity for minoritarian rule, which we've seen come in 2000 and 2016, where minority votes because of the primary system that got the candidates in, you've got people who are being elected who were put into the nomination slot by as little as 10 to 20% of the American electorate, right? Our system creates the root for minoritarian rule, and the checks and balances that our system has had into place are being sorely tested now, as we've come to understand not only that Supreme Courts can change and change in the way that they interpret, but that a lot of our system is based on norms, not on laws, and a lot of those norms are being blown up right now.
This would be the last question because we need to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
I apologize to being.
Well, my apologies for talking so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a comment. I find the contrast remarkable that in 2020, Trump supported vigorously that the election was rigged, that it was fraudulent. By the same token, he made no comment about 2016, because just as equally, 2016's election could have been rigged and fraudulent. But no one in the media that I've seen makes that connection.
Yeah. Winners write history.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I think there are folks talking about that, but part of this is the fracturing and the breakdown of our media landscape at the same time that the strategy that I'm going to use the Trump campaign as an example, just as an example. This isn't meant to editorialize, but as you saw on the slide of Joseph McCarthy, I don't know if anybody noticed the figure next to Joseph McCarthy. Who was that? It was Roy Cohn, who was a mentor of Donald Trump. And in the same way that Roy Cohn tested out certain ideas, certain populist rhetorical ideas with Joseph McCarthy of accusing elites as being enemies of the people without evidence. You see that continuing in it's in harmony with Donald Trump. Also, it was the idea of flooding the zone with misinformation or disinformation. And when our fractured media ecosystem is being flooded on a daily basis with dramatic statements that in years past, each and every one of them were gestures. If anybody watched the gestures at the microphone the other day at the campaign, these would be disqualifying rhetoric and gestures. And we've got to ask ourselves, what's happened to the public square that has been so overwhelmed and shock-loaded that it can't digest and process in the way it traditionally did, that kind of rhetoric and those gestures.
Do you see any hope?
I'm sorry?
Do you see any hope?
Do I see any hope? Yeah, ask me later in the week. I think I am hopeful. My own politics, I'm hopeful about the outcome of this election, but I am girded for certainty that it is going to be contested and that it is going to be a very uncomfortable couple months because of that. But just to put things into perspective, right? There was political violence, right? The assassination attempts on Trump, the violence, the activated militias, the stand by and stand back. Let's remember, the political violence in the 1960s, right? Let's remember, for a century after the Civil War, the incredible political violence that was meted out continuously throughout part of this country to manage voting. I mean, it was worse, right? For all of the high stakes of this election, right? Growing up in a time in which hair-triggered nuclear arsenals pointed at two ideological contenders, I mean, we have a history of, as a democracy, as a broad tent community, kind of, enduring, persisting, and even thriving. So I'm very hopeful for that.
I apologize for all the ones who are raising their hands. Obviously, this is a loaded and intense topic for all of us. Speaking of globalism, as the Chinese curse goes, may you live in interesting times, right? We certainly do live in interesting times, for better and for worse. I'd like to thank you very much, Jamie, for sharing your knowledge with us. I think that when we're kind of like overwhelmed by reality, it's always good to see, to hear people who are knowledgeable, who can speak with, facts and graphs and knowledge and information. Help maybe understand a little bit where we stand. Not that it maybe the beam of light may have shown. I'm not sure that we all come here resolved. But definitely, I think this kind of gathering proves how important it is that we as a community can come together to talk, to listen, to experience, to discuss, to show presence at times when we feel a little bit shaken. So thank you once again. Of course, Jamie isn't disappearing. You know where to find him. If you have more questions, maybe you can stay a few more minutes. I will say once again that in the social hall at 11, which is like in 4 minutes from now, there is you can come and actually make a difference by packing, they told me not kits, but bags for reproductive rights, and there'll also be a small explanation there what that is all about. Next week, I will be talking for the second time this semester and last I called it, if you look, it's called Contemporary Conversation about the weekly portion, which basically means it is a very exciting portion, Parashat Vayera. It has many issues that can be thought about in a contemporary, but I kept it open vaguely because I knew that it would be the week after election. So basically, if we need to vent some more, in other words, this would be a good opportunity for us to come as a community once again next week. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up. Take a bagel, take some coffee. Thank you all for coming.
What a treasure.
I felt like I was. I think so. Yeah, as a matter of fact.
So it will be on our website.
We don't know. No. It should, yeah, let's see. I heard it.